It looks like that's working okay, thankfully. Or have I jinxed it?
Yeah, I'm just checking.
Cool.
Seems to be working.
Jolly good. So let's make a start, and we can always troubleshoot if we need to go along. Have you started the stream? Just start the stream.
Yeah, it started that.
Cool. Welcome everybody. Apologies for that little hiccup. The microphone we usually use, though we did our little test earlier, for some reason when I went to pack back on now didn't want to work. But we've got an alternative, so that should be fine. And that gives a big clue that this is a hybrid event. So I should have probably started with that. So welcome everybody who's here on site at the London Archives. Welcome everybody who's joining us at home. If you're at home, my colleague Rachel will be running the chat there. So if there are any questions with the sound with this new setup, please just pop them in the chat. We'll get that fixed. And if you have questions or comments as we go along, I'll get you to put them in the chat as we go along. But we'll take all questions as one at the end, and that goes for people in the room as well. So we'll have some time for questions and comments at the end. And I'm also duty bound to say we're not expecting the fire alarm to go off this afternoon. So should the fire alarm go off, we need to leave the building. Which we do by going out of these doors and back down the main set of stairs. But other than that, thank you again for that little false start. And this is a fun one for me. So as some of you will be aware, or you'll be aware now, the Magna Carta is on display here at the London Archives. And despite its over 800-year history, not quite actually, the Magna Carta is nearly 800 year history, and ours is about sort of 730 or so years old. It's never been on display at this site before. It's been on display at the Guildhall a few times, most notably around the anniversary of the 1215 signing of the Magna Carta, and that was actually one of the first projects I worked on when I came back to London Archives. I worked here a little bit, and then I came back, and I've been working here ever since. So this is both a nice sort of nostalgia for me to work on this, and a terrifying reminder of how quickly time flies all at the same time. And it's a fun one because the Magna Carta is a very famous document. I'm prepared to say, I'm going to go out on a limb here, it's probably the most famous document in the sort of English archival tradition. There's a few contenders. I think the Domesday Book is probably its best rival, maybe. And then if we want to stretch things, we might say the First Folio, Shakespeare's First Folio, but that's a rare book, really, isn't it? I think we can all agree on that much. If nothing else, that's more of a rare book than an archival document. And I think it even has a claim to be the most famous archival document in the whole Western canon. But I think it probably is defeated by that on maybe the Declaration of Independence, American Independence, possibly the American Constitution. But as we will hear, those are sort of spiritual successors to this document anyway. So this is a really sort of important document to have here. So it's a very famous document. But I think you'll all agree, sometimes the more famous something is, the more we think we know about something, we can actually find that we don't know as much about it as we might think. Maybe not the people in this room at home, erudite crowd that you are, the very fact that you've come here distinguishes you from many people. But I'm sure you'll agree with the general sentiment that sometimes familiarity means we don't know how much we know about things. So I hope by the end of this talk, you will sort of know a bit more about the Magna Carta to sort of alternatively impress or perhaps annoy your friends and family with your Magna Carta knowledge. And this next section even might save you a little bit of legal trouble too. So with that, we will get on. So in August 2021, one Sinead Quinn was required to pay a total of £8,436 in fines and costs after magistrates found her guilty of 10 charges relating to lockdown breaking activity in November 2020. This case might be familiar to some of you. This was the hairdresser that kept their salon open in spite of the lockdown legislation at the time, requiring them to close the business. And a year before that, so in 2020, a small group of protesters, around 30, gathered at Edinburgh Castle. They gathered at Edinburgh Castle. Well, their reports say they preferred the term seized. And this, in their mind, was the first step of an insurrection designed to take power back from the Crown and defeat a fraudulent government tyranny. Now, lockdown was a strange and often sad time for lots of us. So there was all kinds of different and aberrant and illegal behaviour that went on then. But one thing that these two examples have in common is actually the Magna Carta. And in particular, Clause 61 of the short-lived 1215 iteration illustration of the Magna Carta, and we can see it on the screen here. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it all out, but I thought it was nice to have it there as a backdrop. This is the famous security clause of the 1215 Magna Carta, and so called because this is designed to make sure that the charter can be enforced, and that we see that at the top there an election of 25 barons in order to keep this charter in force. And this, which we won't go into too much detail, but the text on the screen behind us was interpreted by Sinead Quinn and the protesters, or the insurrectionists at Edinburgh Castle, as justification and protection for their actions in what's become known as a phenomenon called pseudo law, which draws on things like the Magna Carta and turns out spurious legal concepts such as being a freeman on the land and being a sovereign citizen. There's a belief that the Magna Carta gives a right, indeed a justification to defy the law of the land. As we can see, though, because in the fact that the protesters were arrested and that Sinead Quinn was forced to pay nearly £8,500 in fines, this is a spurious legal defence and not one I suggest that you follow. But I do think it does say something quite interesting, and it's actually a pattern that we see, that the Magna Carta is reached for. To say lockdown was a fraught time, and it's interesting that it was the Magna Carta that was there was lots of discussions around liberty and rights, the balance between individuals' freedom versus kind of selective safety and illness, which we don't need to rehearse here. But it was these ideas were very much in the air, and that is a theme that sort of runs through our politics and the other politics. And Magna Carta is very often both at the background and the forefront of this debate. So I thought it would be nice for the next sort of 35-40 minutes or so that we have together to think about what the Magna Carta actually means and some of the myths that have been produced along the way, not necessarily to dispel the myth, but to put it in some kind of context. So we'll first think about the origins of the Magna Carta. Again, something that we think we might know. I'm sure that the rough facts are known to many people in this room. We'll look into a bit of that, and then we'll see how it's played out through the ages. And of course, we'll spend a bit of time with our Magna Carta, which probably takes a bit of explaining. Ours is from 1297, not the famous 1215 date. So we can think a little bit about that as well. This is the sort of the image we probably most commonly associate with the Magna Carta. I'm very happy to premiere this today. So this is in our upstairs. When many of you print off and go, we have an education space. It's just been had a nice facelift, including some new decors and decorations, and soon this will be going on the wall as part of our school's offer. And it sits alongside 5 other sort of key moments in sort of London history. And what we see here is, of course, King John in the middle, being berated by a number. I've not actually counted. It should be 25, but I don't think it is 25.
I just counted. I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
Maybe.
18. So 18 barons, and the document in front, we can of course assume is the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta was granted to King John, as we can see, on the 15th of June in 1215 in Runnymede, which is a meadow on the banks of the Thames. In medieval times, it would have been outside London. Its location chosen really because of its it was an open field, therefore hard to conduct an ambush. It was within a day's travel of both London and Windsor Castle, where our factions were based. And King John grants a Magna Carta to the barons, and the barons, we can see 7 short of their true number on the screen there. Again, a word you'll have heard quite a lot, but who were they? Barons at this time were the top level of the feudal hierarchy, those who held land directly from the king, and there are about 200 of them in total. You'll also hear of earls. Earls were a subset of the barons, the most sort of powerful barons, because they had responsibility for local courts as well, and there are around 20 of those. And this is to say then that although we have Magna Carta often portrayed as something to protect the common man, to some kind of statement of universal rights, to protect a small business in their framing of it, to protect a small business owner against the overreach of government, it starts as very much a dispute, it ends a dispute between very powerful people, the most powerful people in the land at the time. You can think of it as a peace treaty in a civil war known as the Barons' War, and as such, it was the culmination. It was the culmination of a huge, a discrete number of very important grievances that built up throughout the course of King John's reign. So King John comes to the throne in 1199, and by 1215, so sort of a decade and a half, he's managed to make an enemy and then somewhat friend of the Pope. He's managed to lose important lands in Normandy and France more broadly, and alienate the most sort of powerful people in his land. So how does he do that? What are these charges against John that culminates in this? So arguably the most sort of consequential for the kind of the psyche at the time was the loss of lands in France. So today we think of, reasonably enough, we think of the United Kingdom and France as two separate entities, two separate countries. That's where the administrative divide comes down at the border. That's not how it would have been seen in the Middle Ages. Not how it would have been seen at this time. People had connections to their lands, their ancestral lands that would have moved around through inheritance and conquest, of course. And these do not neatly fit the kind of country boundaries we have in our head today. So many, indeed most of the barons that were represented there had lands in England and France, and of course this dates back to the Norman conquest of the years following 1066. So losing lands in France is not losing sort of some foreign possession. It's losing lands that are a core part of lots of these barons' identity, their sense of self, and more importantly, their revenue. It's how they make their money. It's how they get their prestige. So when John loses these lands early in his reign, and then the project of the reign is to try and get them back. And to do that, you need men and armies, and to get men and armies, you need money. And so John becomes known as a kind of voracious taxer of people, in order to both line his own pockets. There's a real sort of personal grasping character about John's behaviour, but also because he needs money to fund his armies. Because of his personal unpopularity, the armies that he ends up employing are foreign mercenaries, rather than calling on the military services and the retinues of his own barons, which therefore require more money, requires more taxation, further alienates his population, and further gives the sense of him being, sort of a tyrant, is the word that was commonly used at the time. Also, throughout this period, we see from 1205, we see a serious and consequential dispute with the papacy, so with the Pope. Medieval England, or the medieval Europe in general, is a staunchly religious time. The religious rituals mark both the life cycle and the daily cycle as well. And in 1205, there's a dispute between King John and the Pope over the appointment of a new archbishop following the death of the incumbent. And basically, John wants his preferred candidate. The church wants another candidate. The Pope wants another candidate. They're unable to settle, and the consequence is King John is personally excommunicated by the Pope. But more consequentially for his reign, the country is placed under what's called interdict. Now, what this means in general terms is that the church has gone on strike, or the clergy are prohibited from performing the rites and rituals of both daily life and the life cycle as well. Interestingly, none of the sources I've read, the sort of secondary sources I've read for this, quite agree on what this means. There's some points of agreement that would have been significant enough. No saying of mass on a Sunday, a prohibition on ringing church bells, no saying of marriage, no last rites and some sacraments. But there are disputes with quite inconsistencies, I should say, with what's said. Some accounts will say there were no baptisms, which didn't quite sit right with me. Baptism was a hugely important sacrament in the medieval mind. Unbaptized babies were thought to go straight to hell because of the doctrine of original sin. So as I say, there are conflicting reports on this, but the one that I sort of put the most store in because it passes my detail test. I often think the more detailed the account, often the more accurate it is in historical terms. Not a general rule, but a useful one in this case. That seemed to suggest that you could still perform baptisms, but there was a limit of the holy oil required to perform the sacrament. In fact, that was being rationed, and as this interdict goes on, the supply of this is dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. So we're not seeing the babies go straight to hell, but we are seeing this being a kind of a looming concern. And as I say, for a devoutly religious, an importantly religious sort of psyche, this was a very big kind of black mark against John, and it's only resolved in 1213 when effectively John concedes to the Pope, and through quite a clever bit of political chicanery, he agrees to be the Pope's vassal. He sometimes sort of flowery put it to hand the kingdom over to the Pope. He agrees to be the Pope's vassal. In practical terms, this doesn't mean very much. He doesn't lose very much, practically speaking, by doing this. What it means in practice is, first of all, the interdict is lifted, and more importantly, the Pope becomes an ally of King John, and this will be useful for him later on, as we will hear. So we've heard about his sort of military failure. We've heard about his dispute with the Pope, and we can't as well, and I can't emphasize enough the extent that he was disliked personally for his actions. He was strongly believed to have murdered his nephew in order to ensure his succession, and took glee in the matter as well. So there's some sharp practice, as you might say, in all medieval kings, bordering on sort of the murderous. But John seemed to take this to a particular level and a particular sadism. So he was immensely disliked for that as well. And this culminates in the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, which is described by John France as the most important battle in English history that no one has ever heard of. The reason being is the Battle of Bouvines makes this final. Through the sort of the first, or that would be my spin on it. So in the early part of this reign, the barons think, well, we might get the lands back. This might change. This isn't a permanent situation. We might be rid of him. He might spend more time in France, or I can spend more time in France. We can get away from him. We can protect ourselves from him. But the Battle of Bouvines is a rare thing in medieval warfare. It's a decisive battle, and it's a battle that goes against King John. What King John tries to do in typical sort of Machiavellian fashion, he has his own army of mercenaries technically, and he also makes allies with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto and the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne, and the idea is that they will have a two-pronged attack against the armies of the King of France, who has taken the French lands. It's a complicated plan, and as often the way, complicated plans don't work. The idea is the armies sort of rendezvous and take on the French force in a combined fashion. This doesn't work. The army under the Holy Roman Empire is defeated, alongside that of the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne, and John's army never actually makes the field. And as I say, this tells us that this is a permanent situation. They're not going to get rid of John, so some redress is required. And this is the long backdrop to the Magna Carta. So we've heard that they meet at Runnymede, just outside London, on marshy ground, not fit for horses or heavy military equipment, a hard place to stage an ambush. And what happens is the grievances of the past sort of 16 years come to a head, and the barons put their demands to the king. 63 clauses in total in this 1215 iteration that cover all different aspects of feudal custom, justice, taxes, local government, towns and trade, appointments, patronage, the use of forests and rivers, the treatment of the Welsh and the Scots. All of this framed in terms of grievance. All of this termed in terms of King John's disrespect of feudal traditions. And it's worth dwelling on this because, as I say, Magna Carta today has become a sort of some abstract symbol of liberty and justice. Nothing wrong with that. Those are all good things that I think we can all agree that we want protected. But it's not how it was thought of at the time necessarily. And a good example, or it was at the time, but it was in practical solutions to practical problems that they were concerned about and of a narrow section of society. And I think a nice example of that sort of seeming incongruence between the demands of the barons and our popular abstract notion of the Magna Carta is the 33rd clause in the 1215 Magna Carta. And that simply states, all fish weirs are in future to be entirely removed from the Thames and the Medway and throughout the whole of England, except on the sea coast. So a practical day-to-day matter, but actually of some importance. Fish weirs are fishing traps, effectively. They catch the fish, and this was causing problems both directly in terms of if you catch too many fish downstream, salmon can't go upstream to spawn. There's a kind of ecological concern, and that was noted, and also the traps themselves and the effect they have on the flow and the sediment in the river make navigation of these rivers more difficult, and so it's a practical problem, but one that seems incongruous, as I say, to our common idea of the Magna Carta. But of course, included in it, which we will come to, are the famous clauses around justice, the so-called Golden Clause, which we will come to shortly. But before that, I want to make a note of, as I say, this talk will give you the ability to both sort of impress and annoy your family and friends. And one good way of doing that is to be pedantic about how we say the Magna Carta was agreed. So you'll hear I was quite careful. I said the Magna Carta was granted. I didn't say signed. People get cross with you if you say the Magna Carta was signed. So in lots of the popular images to do with the Magna Carta, including slightly embarrassingly the 2015 Royal Mint coin, we see King John signing the Magna Carta with a quill pen. If you are able to have a look, if those of you on site today, if you have a look at our little display that accompanies the Magna Carta, we have some bits of ephemera. Lots of them show King John signing the Magna Carta with a quill pen. Now, I have no issue, I should say, with the sort of simple turn of phrase, signing the Magna Carta. It's actually a lot easier than all the kind of pedant avoiding alternatives that are used, but we do want to understand what happens. We do want to understand how royal authority was demonstrated at this time, and it was through seals. So you'll often hear the Magna Carta being sealed, and it's the seal that we can see an example of the type of seal that would be used on the screen here and now in a bit more close up. And this is not from the Magna Carta, I should say. This is from the mayoralty charter of the same era, 1215, issued by King John as part of this dispute with the barons. Incidentally, this is the charter which gives London, the City of London, its Lord Mayor, and this is in effect to this day. But what's nice about this seal is it was used in 1976. It was used when the British government gifted the American government a sort of a replica of the Magna Carta to celebrate the bicentenary of American independence, and this is basically the best surviving example of King John's seal attached to this charter. None of the rest of the seals from that time to survive to this quality. I'm afraid it's a bit washed out with the light. But what I hope you can get a sense of is the first of all, just the quality of the seal, how well preserved it is, and the two sides of the seal. So on the front, we have John on their throne. On the side, on the back, we have them on horseback. And this is a traditional motif you see throughout medieval seals, the idea being it symbolises the twin roles of the king, of a kind of keeper of justice, but also a defender of the kingdom. And it's obviously John didn't do either of them very well, so it's sort of a slightly ironic statement in this occasion. So I've been sort of hinting at something. I've been talking about the 1215 iteration of the Magna Carta. I've been sort of a bit coy about that. So now maybe it's time to just grasp that particular nettle. Because when we say the Magna Carta, well, that's not quite right. Technically, there are 6 editions of the Magna Carta and many copies of each of each edition. So there's the 1215 Magna Carta that King John grants of June 1215. He soon reneges on that. Indeed, he recruits the Pope to say that it was an unjust document because of that securities clause that we opened the talk with. There's a 1215, there's a 12, and then a 1216 and a 1217. And the 16 and 17 are not issued by John because John dies shortly after issuing the Magna Carta. His reneging on the Magna Carta enacts a civil war, but early in this civil war he dies of dysentery. The throne passes to his 9-year-old son. He will become King Henry III. But King Henry III, being just a boy, aged 9 years old, is not sort of seen by everyone as the proper successor, and obviously in part because he is from John's lineage. So a civil war ensues with Prince Louis of France being brought in by some of the barons to be their candidate. But it's through the clever use of the Regency and the Magna Carta by one William Marshall, who is an interesting figure in of himself. He's often described as the greatest medieval knight, a very powerful and skillful soldier and statesman. He becomes Henry's regent, and he realises that if he can reissue Magna Carta, shorn of the most troublesome clauses that would restrict too much of the king's powers, and that would in effect be a useful way to bring some of the barons on their side, to give a guarantee of when he reaches his age of majority that Henry III will be a just king. So we see that issued, and it works. The civil war is won by Henry's side, and then in 1225, when Henry reaches his age of majority, the Magna Carta is reissued once again, and this is a much later print which depicts that. And it's the 1225 Magna Carta that has the most sort of force in law throughout the 13th century, and it's the version from which all the version of the text from which the two later editions are kept. And that is where one of our Magna Cartas comes in. So it's issued two more times, in 1297 and 1300, this time by Edward I. And whereas our previous, so King John, famously terrible king, so terrible we've only had one of them, no king wanting to take that name ever again, lest they be associated with it. Henry III's reign is often described as disastrous, a good builder of nice things we can look at now, but less good for his subjects at the time. But his son is seen as one of the most, sort of, by the standards of medieval kingship, one of the most capable and effective medieval kings. This is Edward I, known by Longshanks because of his tall appearance, but also by two other names which really which give us a indication of the story behind this version of the Magna Carta. So he's known as the English Justinian, and he's known as the Hammer of the Scots. And what these suggest is his two favourite pastimes: passing laws and fighting wars. And these were seen as the key things that medieval kings should do, and he did them, say, in the terms of the day, very well indeed. But he did have no king is perfect, and in 1297 Edward was starting to push his luck maybe a little bit too far in some senses for the barons. So he'd successfully conquered Wales. He was having some success in Scotland. He was struggling in some of his wars in France. He was usually pretty good at forming conciliatory relations with his barons, but maybe he was taking the taxation a little bit too far. So he felt moved to reissue Magna Carta and what's called the Forest Charter as well, another important document this time that we've not touched on today. He reissues those charters, and importantly, and linking to the other nickname of his, the English Justinian, this is the first time that they enter what we call the statute book. So this is the first time they become laws, if you like, that affect the running of the kingdom, rather than an agreement between the king and his subjects. This is an important sort of an important milestone in the history of the Magna Carta. And in 1300, it's issued one last time for similar reasons, and in our collection we have a 1297 and a 1300. But this is the 1297. This is the copy that is on display here today. And maybe if you have a moment, Rachel, you could find the link for the online version. If you use the digital document, and pop that in the chat. That's the version that we're seeing here, so it's available online as well. So if you can't make it here in person, which I fully understand, time and geography can get in the way. You can see this on our digital viewer as well, and it's a really nice high resolution copy. And so this then is a chance to talk a little bit about the Magna Carta as a thing rather than an idea. So it's a largish charter, about 50 by 40 centimeters, made from vellum. So vellum is animal skin that's been treated. It's a bit like making leather, but you want a different part of the skin. It's a very expensive but very durable archival medium, as is shown by the survival of the Magna Carta. This is the copy that belongs to the City of London Corporation, and it's one of the best. It's one of the best kept Magna Cartas. It's in very good condition. It doesn't actually come out very often, so it's particularly special to have out at the moment, and that's why it's in quite good condition. I'll go forward and then go back on the slides. One of the reasons that it's in one of the reasons it's doesn't get out very often, but it did have does leave the building sometimes, and in particular during the Second World War, it was folded, and you can actually see, I think, on the screen in the presentation there, you can see the fold lines there. It was folded and stored in the vaults of the Bank of England for obviously to protect it against bombing during the war. So vellum survives very well, as we heard. It's I'm just going to go back. Sorry, Rachel. We heard it's very expensive, and that explains the slightly annoying feature of the Magna Carta. It's very hard to read, partly because of the script, partly because of the language. It's medieval Latin, which was the language of official documents at the time. Some court documents are written in French, but the highest level stuff is written in Latin, and the script is known as English hand or Chancery hand or Anglicana. Because it's expensive, they don't put a lot of spaces in it, so it's actually quite hard to find the individual clauses. So although it's 40 by 50 centimeters, it's estimated it would take about half an hour if you were to read this out loud. So it's a very dense document. A few features to point out. There's a small note on the margin. I'll just point it out there for you. A bit hard to see. That mentions London, because this is one of the important clauses, which is that the City of London shall enjoy all its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water. We will and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns and ports shall enjoy their liberties and customs. So we'd quite like in this archive to sort of highlight the fact that London is mentioned by name in this document. There's a few other features that we can point out. One is that it actually says London on the bottom right-hand corner there, and that relates to this other interesting feature. We can see there's what we call a writ, so there's an attachment appended or sewed at the bottom left-hand corner, and that's a bit like the cover letter. That's a covering letter, and that's an instruction. I'll just skip through. Yes, so you can see that in a bit more detail. Sorry, so that's the note there on the left-hand side. That's sort of like the shorthand for nota. And then you can see London along there. So that there. And then on the bottom, you can see London is mentioned, and the other thing that was attached to the bottom, is this what we call writ or instruction in Latin above, translated below. But what this tells us is how the Magna Carta was used. This is an age before mass media. It's an age before social media. How did people know about the Magna Carta? Well, many copies were made, and they were distributed throughout the land to be displayed often in churches, but also guild halls as well. And so people will be aware of the rights that were being talked about. And this, as I say, is the instruction from the Chancery for it to be displayed. We've skirted around this quite a lot, but it's probably worth being explicit about it. So I've sort of been quite deflationary so far about the meaning of the Magna Carta, saying it's just, barren swabbling, doesn't mean anything. It's 800 years old. It's nice to look at. Maybe I've taken that a bit too far, and if so, I apologise, because there is a very important clause in the Magna Carta. There is some very important meaning behind it, and that's encapsulated in what's sometimes called the golden clause, and it's the golden clause that we can see starting here, and this is where I really wish I'd paid attention rather than whining the teacher in Latin. Here we go. You can see no free man. Word I can't pronounce. Liber homo. That no free man is the start of the so-called golden clause, or the golden passage, which in slightly truncated form says, no free man shall be imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. And this is often seen as a necessitation of jury trial, and more importantly, it's seen as showing that the king is not above the law, the king is under the law, that laws apply to kings as well. And it's this principle, as demonstrated in this clause and a few other ones as well, that have given it this legacy, that it lets us tell this story as it being a kind of the birth of liberty, the what's sometimes seen as a peculiarly English tradition, although we might take some exception to that of the sense of liberty and the rights of the free man. And that idea really gains popularity once we leave the medieval period and we end up in the sort of, it's called the early modern, or the 17th century, if you want to be a bit more concrete about it. Throughout the 17th century, we see various disputes between the king and his subjects, but this time it's sort of a lower, we might say, like a lower strata of society, or economic strata of society, I should say. I don't want to cast any other meaning than that to it, because the 17th century obviously sees religious and economic disputes between the king and his parliament, with the newly powerful merchant class, that culminates with the English Civil War and the beheading of Charles I, who we can see here in black along here, following his trial at Westminster. And it's at this point that Magna Carta starts to mean something more than the practical dispute that we've had before. So we see various first 16th century humanists and then 17th century lawyers, most famously Sir Edward Coke and John Selden, suggest that Magna Carta enshrines the right of the liberties of individuals against the crown, and it's used, I say, throughout that century, first against King James and later against Charles I. A tradition that culminates in 1689, following the Glorious Revolution, so-called Glorious Revolution, with the issuing of a Bill of Rights, an English Bill of Rights, which is set to hold the new king, William of Orange, and his wife, whose names fall out of my head, which is very embarrassing. hold them to thank you. Yeah, mental block there. Hold them to account, and this in turn inspires this in turn is thought to inspire the drafters of the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution. It's thought these ideas swirling around inspire the opposition to the crown, and again enshrines this idea of the Magna Carta as being a symbol of something more than a 13th century baronial dispute, and marks the and as such the American Bar Association rose this memorial on the site of Runnymede in the years sort of preceding the following the Second World War. And the Magna Carta too was thought to inform the UN Convention on Human Rights as well. So we start to see this bigger symbolism come through. We talked about, at the beginning, with our opening anecdote, we talked about how the Magna Carta doesn't do you much good when you're trying to avoid lockdown legislation. That's because there are only 3 valid clauses left on the Magna Carta that have been brought into the modern statute books, and Because what we see is in the early 19th century, the Georgian and Victorian parliaments basically sort of tidying up the law, trying to codify it. This was very much sort of in vogue at the time, taken to a much higher degree on the continent under Napoleon, but that same traditional legal thinking affected this country as well. So the three, should you need a bit of legal advice, the three valid clauses are relating to the Church of England. The English Church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. That's clause 1. Clause 13. The City of London shall enjoy all its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water. We also will and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns and ports shall enjoy all their liberties and customs. We heard that one before. And then finally, the so-called golden passage. No free man shall be imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay the rights of justice. And it's this last clause that again means that people come back to Magna Carta in times of sort of sorrow and conflict, and the next slide is a real reminder of that. So obviously in 2000 and 2005 there was the awful bombings on July on the 7/7 bombings, and as part of the security measures to try and stop that happening, again, there was much debate around sort of terror legislation, around the appropriate legal standards for detaining people, the appropriate legal standards, evidence, and the like. Often around the idea of habeas corpus, how long you can detain someone without trial. Again, things that are referenced in the Magna Carta. And so again, in a time of sort of sorrow and difficulty, Magna Carta is referred to. People claiming that the proposed legislation, breached the ideals of Magna Carta, and a quite interesting sort of counter opinion to that was that of Lord Carlisle of Bury, who was a British barrister and important for this example. He was the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation from 2001 to 2011. And he says this of the Magna Carta being used in that way. I'm fed up with hearing about Magna Carta. So fed up that I generally carry a copy of it with me, if only to prove to those who refer to it that it is sexist, racist and classist. It gives no guarantee other than there will be a system of law in place if freedom is to be removed in any respect. And I'm absolutely confident that Liberty, whose management board I used to be on at the time of the miners' strike, by the way, will be marching down Whitehall in protest at Magna Carta if anything remotely like it was enacted at the present time. I prefer serious debate to emotional outbursts, wherever they come from, about Magna Carta. So quite a scathing criticism of the legal power of Magna Carta to protect in difficult times, but a criticism that is unheard because, again, a slightly downbeat note to what I hope was an interesting and entertaining talk. Magna Carta is in the news again, not here, but some of you will have no doubt noted that in May this year, the British Library's Magna Carta, one of the few 1215 Magna Cartas, was attacked. I mean, that might be overselling it. The case that it was in was attacked with probably no real prospect of damage, but I think the symbolism is still not very nice for those of us that do work in this field and do our best to keep these things safe. And that attack the attack on the case was by the Reverend Parfitt and Miss Bruce. One wielded the chisel, the other the hammer. And they say that the Magna Carta is rightly revered, being of great importance to our history, to our freedoms and our laws, but then go on to say, as you might expect, but not as important as the climate. And if we consider then the company it's kept in these last few years of attacks on cultural treasures, we have the Magna Carta, we have the sunflowers, and we have Stonehenge on the screen here. So again, giving a sense of the importance of the Magna Carta, if certainly not in its sort of practical effects to the modern day, but certainly in its sort of view in the popular imagination. And I have no doubt, whatever the next crisis is that befalls us, hopefully no time soon, in some way the Magna Carta will appear and be made relevant to that as well. So on that note, thank you for your attention. Very happy to take questions. If we have questions from the room, we'll maybe start with them first, and then if there's any questions from the chat, we'll move on to them because there tends to be a bit of a delay with the chat. So are there any questions or comments about any of that, or do you now feel fully briefed? Yeah.
So there was a great fire in 1666.
Mm-hmm.
And were any copies lost, and how did the copies survive?
So I'll just repeat the question for the benefit of people at home. So the question was, were copies of the Magna Carta lost in the Great Fire of 1666? Not that I'm aware, actually. So obviously it was Great Fire of London, and the Guildhall survived, didn't it, Rachel? The Great Fire. It didn't come quite that. You think I know as well? I want to say that it did. I want to say that the Guildhall survived, but now I'm blushing because I'm not sure that it did. Yeah.
The roof was burnt and one of the crypts collapsed.
Thank you very much. Yes. So there's a very helpful. This is both the joy and the challenge of giving this question to people that we know what they're talking about. Often the room is wiser than I am. So the Guildhall was damaged but not destroyed. So the roof was burnt and one of the crypts collapsed, but it itself wasn't. So hence that one surviving. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, but I'll wait.
Thank you. Yeah. Are there questions from home? Yeah, Rachel. No. Yeah. So no. Go ahead. Yeah.
So you made a reference to something before you mentioned the Stonehenge that I might not understand.
Oh, so yeah, of course. So yeah, of course. So
you said something about sunflowers.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So yeah. Oh, sorry. The painting. Yes. So there have been a series of basically attacks on. So in the National Portrait Gallery, the soup that was thrown on the. Sorry, I should have explained that more. That's my fault. So we've seen as part of the Just Stop Oil process. We've seen attacks on very important, meaningful cultural artifacts, Magna Carta, Stonehenge, and soup being thrown on the Van Gogh's sunflowers in the National Gallery, Portrait Gallery. Yeah. Thank you.
And the attack on the Magna Carta had to do with people not recognizing something about climate change or something?
Yes, exactly right. So the protests are an organisation called Just Stop Oil, and it's their claim, which isn't an unreasonable one, perhaps, that not enough is being done to combat climate change. Where I think they lose a lot of people's support is the direct action they're taking, or some of the direct action that they're taking, including these attacks on cultural treasures. So in May of that year, two people started to sort of try and chisel into the case of the Magna Carta that's on display in the British Library. As you might expect, it's a very robust case, so the case was damaged, probably some amount of expense, but no real harm to the thing. And the idea basically behind these protests is that these things are important, we protect these things, why aren't we protecting the environment? That's the rationale. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
I believe there is a copy in Lincoln Cathedral.
That's right.
And a copy in Salisbury.
That's right, yeah. So
are there the 12, 15 versions?
That's right, yeah.
And so there were copies made to advertise the law across the land, basically.
Exactly that. So there are 4 surviving copies of 1215, 2 in British Library, 2, as you mentioned, Lincoln and Salisbury. We suspect about 40 to 50 copies were made in total, and those are the 4 surviving ones that we know of. And in that trope that you hear, which always casts slight doubts on our ability to manage our collections, every so often one does resurface, which is a bit funny. But yes, the 4 that we know are from 1215, and 13 of the 1297, I want to say. Yep.
You gave us a lot of information. It's a wonderful talk, and I wanted to focus on something more political that you may know about. And so you said William Marshall brokered a revision of the Magna Carta.
Yeah.
Is part of the dynamics of that brokering because some of the barons thought the Magna Carta gave the barons too much power?
Yeah, good question. I'll just repeat that for the audience home, and apologies if I didn't repeat the previous question. Hopefully the answer was clear. The question was clear from the answer. So the question was just about the William Marshall's brokering of the Magna Carta that changed the 1215. What happened there, and did the barons think it had gone too far? That's not my understanding. So my understanding is that there were some clauses in the Magna Carta, actually that securities clause that I showed you and a few other, that the king just took it too far. It basically stripped them of too much of their power, and there's no way that they could agree to that. There's no way that they could effectively agree to being having their authority so closely scrutinised by what's effectively a baronial council. So William wasn't, if you like, prepared to put that forward for his regent. So it's the security clause and a couple other which do escape me, which are taken out at that point. So the idea is basically that version of the Magna Carta, which becomes the 1225 Magna Carta, respects royal authority. It establishes the general principle that the king is not above the law, but it doesn't meddle to such a gratuitous extent into the day-to-day running of the kingdom. I put it like that. Does that make sense?
Yes and no. You just mentioned a concept that I hadn't heard previously in your presentation about how the king is not above the law. So maybe, in my ignorance, I'm not understanding.
No. Why would you? So what that
is more ample, and of course, this is all the more important to me as an American.
Sure.
Because our Supreme Court just made a decision to the effect that the president can be above the law. Right. So going back. So
what that means is that. Well, the thing is, the laws apply to everyone. So the king can make laws, and there is a process that there's a legislative process that allows that to happen. But once those laws are made, they apply to everyone. So the king can't do just what he wants. He is bound by the law of the land. And that was seen at this point as a novel development. Before that, there was a strong idea, certainly from the throne's perspective, that the king could sort of do what they want. The law applied to his subjects, not to him. Yeah.
And that came out of the Golden Clause.
That's right. That's a manifestation of that, and a few others as well. Yeah, exactly that. Thank you. Do you have any questions from home, Richard? Okay, so we'll take this question here then.
Was Magna Carta mentioned directly in the trial of Charles I?
I don't know. I'm not aware. I don't know. I think the legal principles were going back to those laws I mentioned, but I don't know. I'm afraid specifically if it was mentioned by name. Thank you. Sorry, and the question there was, I keep on forgetting the question. The question was just that, was the Magna Carta specifically mentioned in the trial of King Charles I? And George said, I don't know. And sorry, yes, here, yeah.
Then I have a question following what you just asked. In the trial of Charles I, you have the impression that the king hasn't caught up with where the wind was blowing, and he was sort of not understanding that he had to apply the law.
Yeah.
So what's going on when a king really further down the line hasn't really grasped the symbolic meaning of the Magna Carta?
Yeah. So the question was why what we seem to be seeing with the trial of Charles I is almost a rerun of some of these issues. How has the king not grasped the issue that the king is not above the law? And there's a couple of answers to I would give to that. One is in part because if we think of King Charles as lineage, his father James I is first a Scottish king before becoming the combined throne, and there's a different legal tradition there. I don't know a huge amount about that, so I'm happy to credit, but that's my understanding. That's part of it, and partly that Charles was operating a different idea of kingship. So he operated what's famous this idea of the divine right of kings. He had a different idea of what it was to be a king. He believed to be king, an idea he inherited from his father, was that if you are king, you are God's appointed on this earth, and therefore you should be in charge. And that was just a different idea of what kingship meant, with obviously all the violent consequences that ensued.
And of course, by his time, I mean, the world was changing. The wealthy middle class were coming up, and they wanted the power. But that was what started it all, really.
Indeed. So the comment there, which I would just sign off on entirely, and by that point the world was changing, and there was a new middle class that wanted more power. Yeah, indeed.
That's a reference to the 17th century.
That's right. Yes, 17th century. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Jolly good. Are we have any questions from home? So we might pause the stream there. So thank you everyone for joining us at home. I hope that was enjoyable. I hope that was interesting. Thank you for bearing with us with a little hiccup at the beginning. And thank you everyone for joining us in person as well. Thank you very much.